In 1939, America fell in love with a moment of weakness. It was a scene projected on silver screens across the nation, in a movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The scene depicted a young, idealistic senator, played by the lanky and soft-spoken Jimmy Stewart, collapsing on the floor of the Senate. He was exhausted, he was desperate, and when he finally fell, audiences everywhere wept. It was a masterclass in acting. It was the kind of performance that defined a career. When the director Frank Capra finally yelled cut, Jimmy picked himself up from the floor, dusted off his suit, and walked away to grab a coffee. The sweat was fake, the exhaustion was calculated, the danger was non-existent. But 5 years later, in 1944, at 22,000 feet over the frozen landscape of Germany, there was no director to yell cut. When Jimmy Stewart's head slumped forward in the cockpit of a B-24 Liberator, it was not a performance. There was no camera crew to catch the angle. There was no makeup artist to apply the sheen of sweat. There was only the deafening, bone-rattling roar of 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines, and a cold so profound, so aggressive, that it felt like a living thing trying to claw its way through his flight suit. The hose on his oxygen mask had frozen solid. A plug of ice, no larger than a pebble, had formed in the regulator, cutting off the thin stream of air that kept his brain functioning. In the thin atmosphere of the stratosphere, without that hose, a human being has minutes, perhaps seconds, before the lights go out forever. In Hollywood, a well-timed feint wins you an Oscar. But in the cockpit of a heavy bomber, deep in enemy airspace, feinting earns you nothing but a terrifying, screaming descent into the earth. This is the story that wasn't in the script. This is the story of the soldier who lived behind the famous smile. This is the story of what happens when the applause dies down and the flak begins to burst. To understand the horror of that moment in 1944, we have to understand the man who climbed into that plane, because Jimmy Stewart didn't have to be there. In fact, the entire system was designed to keep him away. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, a wave of patriotism swept through the United States. In Hollywood, the studios were in a panic. Their most valuable assets, the leading men who generated millions of dollars in ticket sales, were suddenly talking about enlisting. The studio moguls scrambled to protect their investments. They pulled strings in Washington. They created special roles for actors, designating them as morale officers. The plan was simple: put the stars in uniforms, keep them safe on bases in California or New York, let them sell war bonds, wave at the cameras, and keep making movies. It was a safe, comfortable path. It was the path of least resistance, and for a man like Jimmy Stewart, it was completely unacceptable. The Stewart family didn't view war as a backdrop for a cinema adventure. For them, service was a blood debt. Jimmy's father had served. His grandfather had served. The lineage of duty ran deep in his veins, far deeper than the superficial fame of Tinseltown. Jimmy felt a gnawing emptiness in his life as an actor. He felt that the world he inhabited, the world of stage lights and fake snow, was fundamentally hollow. When the war came, he didn't see it as an inconvenience. He saw it as a chance to finally do something real. But the United States Army didn't want him. When he first tried to enlist, the medical examiners took one look at his lanky, 6'3" frame and shook their heads. He was too skinny. He was 5 pounds under the required weight limit for a pilot. The recruiters told him to go home, to stick to acting. They told him he wasn't built for war. Any other man might have taken the rejection as a sign. He could have told the press he tried, shrugged his shoulders, and gone back to his mansion. But Jimmy Stewart went to a hotel room and locked the door. He didn't call his agent. He didn't call a scriptwriter. He called a trainer and began a regime of force-feeding that bordered on torture. He ate steaks until his jaw ached. He devoured bananas by the bunch. He drank water until he felt like he would burst. He stopped going to the bathroom, desperate to retain every single ounce of mass. He went back to the recruitment office, bloated and nauseous, and stepped on the scale. He made the weight by the skin of his teeth. He was in. But getting in was only the beginning. The Army Air Force, seeing who he was, tried to sideline him. They wanted him to be a flight instructor. They wanted him to stay stateside and teach cadets, keeping his famous face far away from German bullets. Jimmy fought them at every turn. He didn't want to teach. He didn't want to be a mascot. He wanted combat. He demanded a transfer to a unit that was shipping out. And so, the system finally relented. They sent him to England. They sent him to the gray, fog-shrouded airfield at Tibbenham, and they gave him the keys to a beast. They didn't give him the B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was the glamour plane of the war. It was graceful, it was tough, it was legendary. It was the plane that movie directors loved to film. Instead, they assigned Jimmy Stewart to the B-24 Liberator. The pilots who flew the Liberator didn't call it a fortress. They called it the flying brick. They called it the aluminum coffin. It was a slab-sided, ugly, ungainly machine. It was faster than the B-17, yes, and it could carry a heavier bomb load, but it was fragile. Its wings, long and thin, were designed for speed, not for taking punishment. If a B-24 took a hit in the wrong place, the wings had a terrifying tendency to fold up, snapping like dry twigs, sending the fuselage spiraling down like a stone. Flying the B-24 was not a gentle experience. It was a physical wrestling match. There were no hydraulics to help move the control surfaces. To bank the plane, the pilot had to muscle the yoke with brute strength. After a 10-hour mission, pilots would climb out of the cockpit with their arms shaking from muscle failure, drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperatures. And the temperature was a killer in its own right. The B-24 was not pressurized. It was not heated. It was essentially a thin aluminum shell flying through the stratosphere. At 20,000 feet, the outside air temperature dropped to 40, sometimes 50 degrees below zero. It was a cold that defied description. It was so cold that if you took off a glove to adjust a dial and touched the bare metal, your skin would instantly bond to the steel. To pull your hand away meant ripping the flesh from your fingers. It was so cold that the sweat running down your back would freeze into a sheet of ice against your spine. This was the office where Jimmy Stewart went to work. The missions were long, grinding ordeals. They would wake up hours before dawn, stumbling out of corrugated iron huts into the damp English mist. They would eat a breakfast of powdered eggs and stale coffee, trying not to look at the empty chairs of the men who hadn't come back the day before. Then came the briefing, the target map covered in a black curtain, the reveal of the red yarn stretching across Europe to some city deep in the Reich, and then the climb. On the day of the incident, in the bitter winter of 1944, the target was Ludwigshafen. It was a crucial industrial center, home to massive chemical plants that fueled the Nazi war machine. It was also one of the most heavily defended targets on the continent. The Germans knew the value of Ludwigshafen, and they had ringed it with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns. Jimmy Stewart chose silence to deal with his war. We choose to tell these stories so they are never forgotten. If you believe, like we do, that the history of these quiet heroes deserves to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe. Help us keep their memory alive. Jimmy Stewart was leading the 445th Bomb Group. He wasn't just a pilot, he was the command pilot. He sat in the lead aircraft, responsible not just for his own crew, but for the formation behind him. Dozens of aircraft, hundreds of men, all looking to his plane for guidance. The responsibility was crushing. In the air, a formation had to be tight. The bombers had to fly wingtip to wingtip, creating a dense wall of machine gun fire to fend off the German fighter planes. If the lead plane drifted, the formation loosened. If the formation loosened, the German wolves would dive in and tear them apart one by one. As they crossed the enemy coast, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. Every man was scanning the sky, looking for the telltale black specks of Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. But the danger that day didn't come from a bullet. It came from the chemistry of the air itself. They reached 20,000 feet. The world outside the plexiglass was a blinding white and blue. The engines droned on, a hypnotic, endless vibration that rattled the teeth in their skulls. Jimmy checked his instruments. Everything looked normal. He took a breath. But he didn't get air. Somewhere in the complex tangle of rubber hoses and brass valves that made up his oxygen system, a drop of moisture had frozen. It blocked the flow. Hypoxia is a strange and seductive way to die. It is not violent. It does not feel like suffocation. When a person is choked, the body panics because carbon dioxide builds up. But at high altitude, you are exhaling fine. You just aren't inhaling oxygen. The brain doesn't panic. Instead, it begins to shut down the higher functions. Judgment goes first, then vision, then consciousness. But before the darkness comes, there is often a moment of euphoria, a feeling of absolute drunken well-being. As the oxygen levels in his blood plummeted, Jimmy Stewart didn't gasp for air. He didn't claw at his throat. He just relaxed. The tension of the mission, the fear of the flak, the weight of command, it all just drifted away. He felt light. He felt happy. In his mind, perhaps the roar of the engines transformed. Perhaps it sounded like the applause of a packed theater. The biting cold might have felt like the cool air conditioning of a studio soundstage. He wasn't over Nazi Germany anymore. He was back in California. He was safe. The war was just a bad dream, and he was waking up. He smiled behind his mask. His grip on the control yoke loosened. His head grew heavy, too heavy to hold up. His chin dropped to his chest. His eyes, the eyes that had captivated millions, glazed over and stared at nothing. The huge bomber, sensing the pilot's surrender, began to drift. It was a subtle movement at first. The nose dipped slightly. The left wing dropped. But at 200 miles an hour in a tight formation, a drift is a disaster waiting to happen. The plane began to slide out of its slot, moving erratically. Behind him, the other pilots in the formation watched in confusion. Why was the old man drifting? Was it a maneuver? Was he spotting fighters? They tried to follow him, breaking the integrity of the defensive box. The formation was unraveling. Inside the cockpit of the lead plane, the co-pilot was busy checking navigation charts. He felt the lurch. He looked up, expecting to see Stewart correcting the course. Instead, he saw his commander slumped over, looking like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The co-pilot froze for a fraction of a second. This wasn't the movies. The hero wasn't pretending. He reached across the center console, shouting over the roar of the engines, but Jimmy didn't move. The co-pilot didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand into Stewart's shoulder, shaking him violently. He grabbed the emergency oxygen bottle, a portable tank kept for bailouts, and jammed the mask against Jimmy's face, bypassing the frozen system. Pure, cold oxygen rushed into Jimmy Stewart's lungs. The awakening was not gentle. It was violent. It was like being hit in the head with a hammer. The euphoria vanished instantly, replaced by a splitting headache and a surge of nausea. The reality of the war came rushing back in a terrifying flood. The noise, the cold, the vibration, it all assaulted his senses at once. He blinked, gasping, his brain frantically trying to reboot. He looked out the windscreen, trying to orient himself, and that is when he saw it. At the exact moment his consciousness returned, he looked to his left. Right there, flying just yards away, was his wingman. Another B-24, filled with 10 young men. Boys, really. Boys he had eaten breakfast with. Boys he had joked with in the briefing room. As Jimmy watched, a black cloud of flak erupted directly under the wing of that plane. It happened in slow motion, seared into his memory forever. The shell exploded. The wing of the B-24 didn't just break, it folded upwards like a bird closing its wing to dive. Fuel lines ruptured. A ball of orange fire brighter than the sun engulfed the fuselage. There was no time for parachutes, there was no time for radio calls. The plane simply ceased to be a flying machine and became a burning piece of debris, tumbling end over end into the abyss below. Jimmy Stewart sat there, the taste of rubber and pure oxygen in his mouth, and watched 10 of his men die. Seconds ago, he had been in a dream world. He had been happy. Now he was witnessing the brutal, mechanical destruction of human life. The cognitive dissonance was enough to shatter a mind. The contrast between the peaceful, fading dream of hypoxia and the violent, fiery reality of the present was absolute. But he couldn't scream. He couldn't cry. He couldn't freeze. He was the commander. If he fell apart now, the rest of the group would follow. The German fighters would see the gap left by the fallen plane, and they would swarm in. He had to act. He had to be Major Stewart, not Jimmy the actor. He keyed his throat microphone. His voice, famous for its stammer, for its gentle hesitation, was tight and strained. He ordered the formation to close up. He ordered another plane to fill the gap where the burning bomber had just been. He commanded them to fly into the space where their friends had just died, and they did, because he told them to. The rest of the mission was a blur of terror. The flak continued to burst around them, filling the sky with deadly black puffs. They dropped their bombs over Ludwigshafen and turned for home, limping back across the continent, counting the fuel, praying for the English coast to appear through the clouds. When the wheels of his B-24 finally touched the tarmac at Tibbenham, Jimmy Stewart was a different man than the one who had taken off that morning. The ground crew came to help him out of the plane. They expected the usual routine. The pilot climbing down, lighting a cigarette, cracking a joke about the bad food. But when the hatch opened, Jimmy didn't climb out. He fell out. His legs simply wouldn't support him. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 8 hours had evaporated, leaving behind a shaking, empty shell. They practically carried him to the debriefing hut. An intelligence officer handed him a shot of whiskey, the standard medicine for nerves frayed by combat. Jimmy tried to lift the glass to his lips, but he couldn't do it. His hand was trembling so violently that the liquor spilled over his knuckles. He had to use both hands to steady the glass, and even then the glass chattered against his teeth. That night, the officers gathered in the Quonset hut that served as their club. It was a surreal scene, one that played out every night on bomber bases across England. On one side of the base, the ground crews were washing the blood and vomit out of the returning planes. On the other side, in the club, there was music. There was a fire in the stove, there was laughter. Jimmy sat in the corner, staring at a plate of food he couldn't touch. Around him, the phonograph was playing a jazz tune. Men were reading letters from home. It was warm, it was civilized, it was safe, and this safety was the ultimate torture. How does a human mind reconcile these two realities? How do you eat a hot meal while the friends you flew with that morning are nothing but ash in a German field? How do you listen to music when your ears are still ringing with the sound of explosions? This is the invisible wound of the bomber crews. The rapid transition from the savagery of the prehistoric sky to the comfort of the club, it tore men apart. Jimmy Stewart sat there and the actor died. The man who cared about reviews, about box office numbers, about the lighting on a set, that man was gone. In his place was a man who knew the precise weight of a human soul, because he had felt it slip through his fingers. When the war finally ended, Jimmy Stewart returned to Hollywood. But he was not the same golden boy who had left. He had aged 10 years and 3. His hair was graying, his face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over his cheekbones. The spark in his eyes had been replaced by a 1,000-yard stare, a look of profound, quiet sorrow. He made a vow to himself. He would never make a war movie. He refused to turn the horror he had lived into entertainment for the masses. John Wayne could play the soldier. Jimmy knew the truth. But he had to work. His contract was waiting. And the first film he signed on for was a small sentimental story called It's a Wonderful Life. We all know the movie. It's a holiday classic. But watch it again. Watch it closely. There is a scene where the main character, George Bailey, is at the end of his rope. He sits in a bar, unshaven, sweaty, desperate. He clasps his hands together and prays. He asks God for help. He starts to cry. The director, Frank Capra, later said that he didn't expect much from that scene. He thought they would do a few takes, use some glycerin for tears, and move on. He told Jimmy, "Just look sad." But when the cameras rolled, Jimmy Stewart didn't act. The agony you see on his face in that scene is not George Bailey's agony. It is Jimmy Stewart's. In that moment, the barriers he had built around his trauma came crashing down. He wasn't praying for a loan to save the building and loan. He was praying for the forgiveness he never felt he deserved. He was crying for the men of the 445th Bomb Group. He was crying for the face of the boy he saw in the burning plane over Ludwigshafen. He wept so hard, so genuinely, that Capra famously zoomed the camera in, capturing the raw, unfiltered pain of a man who had seen too much. It remains one of the most powerful moments in cinema history, not because of the script, but because it wasn't acting. It was a confession. Jimmy Stewart went on to live a long life. He became a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. He was a beloved icon, but until the day he died, he kept a small black leather-bound book in his pocket. He never showed it to anyone. He never spoke about it in interviews. It was only after he passed away that the contents of the book were revealed. Inside, written in his own handwriting, were the names of the men he had flown with. The men who hadn't come home, the men he had led into the fire. He carried them with him every day, every red carpet event, every award ceremony, every family dinner. The weight of that little book was heavier than any Oscar. We look at the black and white photos of the era, and we see the romance. We see the bomber jackets and the thumbs-up signs. We see the Hollywood version of the war. But the reality was frozen oxygen masks and burning wings. The reality was a 20-minute nightmare that changed a man forever. Jimmy Stewart taught us that true courage isn't about having no fear. It's about being terrified, about being frozen with dread, and still doing your job because others are counting on you. He showed us that the greatest heroes aren't the ones who brag about their battles, but the ones who carry the silence of the fallen in their hearts. The glory was on the screen, but the price was paid in the cockpit. If this story moved you, if you believe that these hidden histories deserve to be remembered, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us dig deeper into the archives and bring more of these untold stories to light. Share this with someone who needs to know the true cost of heroism. Until next time.